this is a map of Port Kembla, which I'll talk to a little bit later on to give significance to this. So this is what is described as an LNG terminal that's already been built in New South Wales. And the work that we've just done on this, which I'll speak to as well, shows that the worst case scenario of something happening here is out to 2K for fatality from a jet fire and a flash fire. And we just superimpose the same concept across the top of Taranaki, because this was, Port Kembla was spoken to by Simon Watts as the Minister of Energy as one of the places that they were looking at. So we just use their documentation to give people an idea of what might come into the port. So just to tell you a little bit about our group, can put it there, yeah. We're a long-standing grassroots community group based here. We have participated over many decades in submissions and hearings to the district and regional plans and resource consents on energy matters in our province, and also to national discussion and legislation on the same. Yep, next one.
Sorry.
Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm not an expert. I'm an expert in education. I'm not an expert as a risk expert, but I do know a little bit about what's happening here in Taranaki, having come from here and lived here most of my life. I'm a head of faculty for technologies in a local high school. I've previously worked in every manner of job in education, so you can see a long list there. I've got 2 postgraduate degrees in education, and I've had different roles in auditing and research theory, doing work in those areas. Yep. What got us started, I think I wanted to give you some context, because we're not standing here because we have nothing to worry about. So a long time ago, actually, 2006, my husband and I participated in the first beginning part of our journey in energy and dealing with council and companies, going to district council hearings for a few years with the councils and the companies. And we lived next to 3 well sites and a production station. So that began for our journey in 2006. What we came to understand during that time is that you can experience adverse effects like noise, and you put in double or triple glazing. You can have issues with light and glare from industry, and you can put up blackout curtains. However, you can't hear or see fatality risk and consequences of fire, explosions, and toxic vapours in the same way until they happen. The risk and consequence assessments and emergency response plans that I'll talk about today are the closest thing to understanding what we describe in the risk industry. I say we now because I've been working with it for 15 plus years. What happens when you have a low probability, high impact, catastrophic event, and what it could look like. And that's what we set about proving back when we first started working on this. I personally began by auditing the Taranaki Regional Council and the district councils after they told me they hadn't been audited. And we hired a risk expert from Australia, good lawyers, and we joined Taranaki Energy Watch. Of relevance to this, to this presentation is the 5 or 6 years we spent in, and I still actually were there longer, 2 environment court cases that we were or are still involved in. The first one was to do with only oil and gas regulation at the time, and in 2020, after 4 years of hearings, we won a significant case that focused on fatality and injury risk and consequence and incompatible activities. In this case, we looked at petroleum facilities and sensitive activities such as homes. After that 4 years, we came away with 4 interim findings, a procedural decision, consent orders, and a final decision. In those cases, we had several oil and gas companies, in fact, the entirety of them, federated farmers, and all 3 territorial authorities from Taranaki were involved on the other side. So we were on this side and they were over there. We currently in Environment Court establishing a similar approach through the case law with all significant hazardous facilities now, not just oil and gas, in the proposed New Plymouth District Plan. At the core of all of this is case law and the judge's findings that there are low probability, high impact catastrophic events that can result in fatalities and injuries beyond the boundary of the hazardous facilities site. And that's what we're here to talk about today with LNG. Location of any facility of this type is critical at the beginning, and the regulators are responsible at the outset to ensure it is safe. The independent risk experts that we were using in the TW versus South Taranaki District Council hearings were our expert from Australia, Jenny Pollich of Sherpa Consulting, and Worley Parsons on behalf of the companies. There was no experts provided by the councils. They relied on us. In the Environment Court hearings for New Plymouth District Council, there have been experts provided this time by all parties. In any establishment of a significant hazardous facility is the determination at the outset of whether the site is the right location in respect to the health and safety of the communities nearby. This is the heart of our case law. WorkSafe's involvement does not mean that an accident won't happen, and it doesn't mean that fatality and injury risk and consequence will be avoided. Recently, 13th of May, a representative of MB sent out a letter, and in it said, health and safety were not explicitly considered in the analysis of any of the options considered. However, it is a requirement that all operations must be consistent with New Zealand's health and safety regulatory requirements. Although LNG is a new energy source for New Zealand, LNG importation is a proven safe technology internationally. Natural gas and LNG are not toxic, and LNG is non-flammable in its liquid form. Another slide. They were mistaken about that. So this extra slide we put in, you could probably speak to it a little bit more than I can, but basically LNG tanker hit in the Strait of Hamas? No, in the Mediterranean, yeah, and caught on fire.
It was hit with a drone deliberately.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate attack.
It goes on to say that the preferred provider will need to further develop a safety case to identify risk and mitigations across the construction and operation of the facility. The safety case will be specific to the design of the proposal and will need to be approved by New Zealand regulators. Officials continue to work closely with the shortlisted providers and with the relevant regulators on health and safety risks and mitigations. What I have to say there after our experience in our case law is this is too late for that. It should start at the very beginning when you determine the location of it. By the time WorkSafe gets involved, we subpoenaed WorkSafe to our case. They came willingly to explain to the regulators that they're there after the fact. It is up to the councils to determine the right place it is in, and sometimes they shudder to think about where we place things. It is definitely location that should come first before the actual plant gets built. And as to no accidents, next slide, yeah, happening. Accidents can and do happen. As I said before, low probability, high impact events. And here I've just listed 4 that if anyone is interested, we can provide you with the data on these. But Cleveland, Ohio, 128 fatalities. Sakita, Algeria, 27. Plymouth, injuries, evacuation and significant property damage. In Freeport, Texas, $275 million worth of damage. The coalition government has previously confirmed that they plan to build it in Taranaki. We don't know yet where. Issues have been raised about climate impacts and the likelihood that importing LNG would raise possibly both gas and electricity prices, but very little attention has been paid to whereabouts are you actually going to put it. In an earlier media statement, Simon Watts, who was the Minister for Energy, said that the government was talking regularly with the LNG terminal at Port Kembla in New South Wales. All the accelerated delivery solution proposals are located in and around Taranaki. So being the researcher and auditor I am, I went and had a look at Port Kembla and discovered a whole lot of paperwork that is actually available publicly to us, but what we want to see for the one that potentially is here is the same, but we're not entitled to that. So I'll explain about that in a minute. So Port Kembla did a preliminary hazardous analysis report that's checking the site of where it's going to be located. It's having LNG carriers, floating storage, regasification units, the wharf and pipelines, very similar to what is suggested as being planned here. It identified a range of hazardous events and examined both the consequences and the risks. Initially, 2 sets were put forward as consequence modelling. They modelled them on a leak of a 100 millimetre hole, and in this case they came to 608 metres respectively for the distance of fatality, not injury. Injury is further. The 100 millimetre hole is considered a large leak. However, good practice for worst case events is a full bore catastrophic rupture, which was finally modelled in October 2023, again by Worsley Parsons, and again according to the New South Wales legislation. In this case, the worst case scenario comes from a flash fire scenario that shows that a full bore rupture will go to 9,984 metres. So that's where the 2,000 came from. So if the worst case scenario was to happen on any day in that port, that is the impact that you would see just for fatality. Port Kembla has now been built. It took a few years to get through this. The terminal at the moment is being held in care and maintenance until 2027 due to a reassessment of customer needs and market conditions. While the Port Kembla terminal is delayed, the Australian government has indicated it has secured sufficient gas supplies to manage shortfalls out until 2029. So circumstances change. So you might build something like this and actually it might just be a white elephant. Worley has recently been confirmed that it will be the one that is providing technical advisory and client engineering support for the terminal to the government. New Zealand does not have a hazard facility guidelines, so they use regularly New South Wales land use planning guidelines. That's what Port Kembla's reports are based on. That's what Energy Watch's work has been based on. For example, in New Zealand, we have the Wiri Terminal, the Lyttelton Port, the Christchurch Rebuild, the Napier Port, and in Taranaki, the Environment Court cases covered Kapuni Production Station, Gas Treatment Plant, Kupe Production Station, Maui Production, Mangahiwa Production, Liquid Gas Methanex, and more recently, Amata, Paratutu Tank Farms, and Pohokura Production Station. None of them have the footprint, the size of the LNG terminal. In fact, the one that is probably closest to it, liquid gas, has a worst case consequence of 600 metres. And I don't know if you're familiar, but down at that site there's these, they look like concrete bunkers. They look very nondescript. That was the liquid gas. It is Energy Watch's experience that the guidelines emphasise that the authorities and the landowners need to understand both the fatality and injury risk and consequences of an activity. Can you put the next slide on? If there are alternatives that can be taken to avoid the risk and consequence, they must be. So we've been involved in a number of cases, not just the ones with the district councils. In this case, it was the Seaport Old Frontier buildings that were wanting to build apartments above a leaking oil and gas well. And we went and said, we don't think that's a good idea. And in the process of doing that and our risk expert being involved, one of the things that came up in the hearing that we gave was all avoidable risks should be avoided. If you can avoid putting an apartment over top of a leaking oil and gas well, you should do that. This necessitates the investigation of alternative locations and alternative technologies wherever applicable to ensure that risks are not introduced in an area where you have feasible alternatives that are possible and justified. Now, we don't know if that's being considered, because this is not being shared with the public. The enabling legislation was put forward by the government as a way of speeding up this process. It's even faster than fast track. The government has confirmed that they will look at doing this, and there is no opportunity for the public to contribute to the decision making around this facility. This is also unlike the Port Kembla example that I showed you, which is done under the same types of guidelines with the same risk experts, where there were several opportunities to have input during the planning and approval phases, including the planning reports. In early 2019 for Port Kembla, there was a detailed environmental impact statement that was put on public exhibition for formal comment. It also allowed community members and organisations to submit their concerns directly to the New South Wales government. In this case, while this was happening, it means that they were able to influence. And if you notice when we go, I don't really want to go back to that, you've got a circle one where you have it. You'll notice for Port Kembla, most of that circle is over top of industry. It's not over the residents. Okay, so there was already a distance put between the residents and the port. And having impact into those decision making around Port Kembla, irrespective of whether LNG is the right thing to do, meant that those people's safety was out to the consequence area. So in closing, if this bad idea does happen, we say not at Port Taranaki, allow the public to be involved, and no public funding of LNG. Gas users, not electricity users, should pay for this. And that's all. Thank you.